Leah, how are you?
I'm great. How are you this morning?
I am wonderful, and we have Michael this morning. Hello, Michael.
Hello, ladies.
Uh-oh. Are we having a bad morning?
Difficulties?
Can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
All right?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us? Okay. See,
Yeah,
that's what I told
my
Julie this morning. Two-edged
My
sword.
computer's kind of acting up a little bit.
Well, you know what's happened, right? The NSA has found you.
I see a delay when you say something. It takes about 2 seconds for the audio to hit my PC. It's
Oh no!
Oh, yikes! Okay, we'll try to talk very slow.
No, it's nothing. You guys, something on my PC. I've been having issues all morning.
Well, just don't throw it, because I've heard that doesn't help.
Yeah. There we go.
I don't know anything about that, but all right. Well, we've got a great show this morning. We have Dr. Robert Mather, who is from Edmond, and I am going to turn it over this morning to Michael. And Michael, why don't you introduce Dr. Mather for us?
Well, yeah, Dr. Mather. I met Dr. Mather through my school board campaign. His wife was really active in my campaign, and she was on a couple of my groups, and we just she was just an absolute treasure. And just through her, I met her husband, Dr. Mather, and before the campaign, he actually gave my wife one of his books, the which one? The Implicit Bias and Unconscious book, and she said, "Hey, my friend Tiffany, her husband wrote this book. You should check it out." And I read it, and I was like, first of all, I was just blown away, because here you have a psychologist of all areas of academia, and we know what academia is like most of the time, but he's a Christian, a conservative, and it was just like a breath of fresh air. And I started listening to his podcast. He's got a podcast called My Patriot Brain, and his website is just absolutely full of information, which that's the conservative, the conservative social psychologist.com. But Dr. Mather, to me, is just, I just absolutely love the way he thinks. And it's more or less along the lines of what I believe science and Christians and just kind of the entire commingling of all of that without real serious bias in one direction or another. He's very open-minded, and I just appreciate everything about him. And I'm glad we could get in touch with him and have him come on the show with us.
Well, I'm looking forward to this. I'm not looking forward to being big like that, but I'm looking forward to having Dr. Mather on. So yeah. I'm going to pull Dr. Mather in. Good morning, Dr. Mather. How are you this morning?
Good morning. I'm fantastic. Thank you all for having me on the show. I enjoy catching your show. You all do a great job.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. I'm going to kind of just I loved what just your introduction, an open-minded psychologist. It sounds like that's something that should be relatively normal, but I almost wonder today, are you in the majority in it? I mean, or is it more of a minority?
No,
But I'd kind of like to hear you talk a little bit about yourself, if you would.
well, I'm very much the minority as far as my political views in the field. There was, I think it's less than 3% or something like that by some surveys in my area of social psychology, and less so in others like counseling or even kind of related fields of mental health like social work. And so there's a very strong bias against conservatives, Christians, Republicans, males, and within all the social sciences. And so I'm kind of an odd duck in that regard. I kept my mouth shut for a while, and got to a point where I could make a difference and kind of be a role model for a lot of those students that we have, particularly at schools like UCO, that are Christian conservatives that come to school and really don't intend on changing their minds. They just want to have good science that they're exposed to, and have people that are open-minded and in the same ways that they are.
Well, I'm going to ask you just a second. What is your background? Explain your background to our viewers.
Well, I grew up in Chickasha, Oklahoma, a small town. My parents were both college professors. My dad was a biology professor. My mom's an education professor. And if you average those, you get an experimental psychology professor. And then, so what I do is I do research. I don't help people. I'm not one of those kind of psychologists. And so I conduct research, attitudes, persuasion, stereotypes, discrimination, parts of the subconscious that can affect the way that we think. Those are the things that I research. I went to Westminster College. I played baseball there. I went to the UCO for my master's degree, and then I got my doctorate at Texas Tech University.
Awesome. Michael, why don't you talk a little bit about the book?
Well, the book was just, I like multiple things in the book. Let me see. I got it right here. We gotta be able to pull that in, but it's kind of like break stereotypes. Let me see. I wrote. It's been a couple years since I've read this.
Yeah, me too.
It was more is kind of breaking stereotypes. It was kind of showing biases, kind of free will. There was just a lot of things that was just kind of on the subconscious and unconscious thinking, kind of behind a lot of things that you do.
Yeah,
Dr. Mather, so why write a book about, unconscious thinking and bias?
So that's my area of expertise. I've written 4 books total, a stats book, a book on how to review books in psychology, and then I wrote a social psychology book on automaticity and cognitive control a number of years ago. And that was probably my favorite book to write. And then, I used it in my social psych classes. There's some other schools across the country that used it as well. There was no, politics involved in it at all. And then once I started writing for Psychology Today, which I guess takes you back a little bit farther, I was asked to write for Psychology Today based on the research that I'd been doing. And when I was talking to the editor, he said, "You've got to come up with, some kind of, unique name for your column. Like what would catch people's attention?" And I said, well, there's a thing I could do if you want me to, if you're willing to, I'm willing to do it. And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I'm a conservative and none of those are out there. And so I would be putting a pretty big target on my back, but I'm willing to do that." And he went for it. And my editor at Psychology Today was extremely supportive of me. He would step in a lot of times when associate editors would come in and shut down my political articles, or would shut it down long enough for it to not be relevant if I was writing about something that was, urgent in the media. And he would always step in and get my back. So, Psychology Today, for as incredibly woke as they are and most of what they put out, they have always defended me. And in fact, I haven't written for them in a few years when they made some changes to their structure. And I got contacted to be, interviewed for an article, and they were talking to me about how much they missed me writing for them. And they talked about how, that perspective was one that they couldn't get in the field. They couldn't get it anywhere else. They loved having it. They loved bringing me in to interview me for articles, even if I'm not writing. And they basically begged me to go back to writing. So they were very supportive from the very beginning, and always were. But anyway,
so I'm just curious because you did. I noticed that you hadn't been writing for them for some time. Have you gone back to? I didn't see anything new. I mean, are you considering going back to writing for them?
I haven't ruled it out. I'm just having so much fun with the podcast and other engagements that I'm doing. And now that I left academia, I run my own company. And so that's, that takes up more time than I really have to dedicate to writing. I'm enjoying doing the podcast that I've created called My Patriot Brain. It's available on Spotify and just about everywhere else. And I enjoy doing that. And it's a different outlet. It's a different kind of creative way for me to express ideas, and just having fun with that. But going back to the book part of it, so once I'd gained that national audience, I realized that there was this thirst for psychology to be accessible to conservatives who are very wary of the sources of a lot of information that they're going to get on science. And so they're missing out on a lot of good science that exists because the people that write it are very politically opinionated, and they either infuse that in what they're writing about their research or whatever. And so I thought, well, maybe I need to go back and pull some of the best things that I've written about in the past and use that, and create, the first half of the book is the science. And the second half of the book are a lot of my Psychology Today articles or other articles that I had written kind of framed around that science. And so, I was really trying to create something that I thought would be palatable to conservatives so that they could pull out the best parts of the science and be able to use that in their own lives.
My Patriot Brain.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Can you explain? What was the thought behind My Patriot Brain?
Well, my wife really came up with that. I kicked around some other ideas, and she really came up with the title. And so, most of my good ideas come from her. That's probably how most good marriages are. But yeah, so I kicked around a number of other ideas, and then when she said, "Well, what about My Patriot Brain?" And I said, "Well, that's awesome. I love that." And so, yeah, and it really is kind of an emptying of my brain, right? It's politics, it's psychology, it's sports. It's kind of whatever's on my mind. And I try to stay true to, what I've described as if somebody just sitting in my garage, drinking a beer with me and having a conversation, we would bounce from different idea to idea. And what would I have to say about these things? And there's a listener component that they can send questions to me, and I try to just answer those as honestly as I can. And it creates for what I think is a very unique and engaging show. I always feel like, kind of like with your show, I always feel like if shows do the same thing that everybody else does, then they're not that interesting. And you've got to be true to what you believe. And you all do a really good job of that too. I think you just keep doing what you're doing with your show.
Oh, that's very sweet.
So I was reading some of your recent posts, and one of them is titled, "Why Do We Have Fake News?" Can you give us that in a summary? Why do we have fake news, and why is it like I don't believe anything almost unless it happens right in front of my face at this point? There's so much fake news.
Well, I don't remember that particular post, but I know that one part of that is that we have what's called failure of source monitoring, and so we don't always remember where we hear something, and so you can create a false memory. You can create fake narratives. You can tell somebody something that's not true, and it may stick with them. And so even not getting into the components of who you trust, who you don't trust, what you verify and don't verify, et cetera, those things that are floating around can stick in your brains.
Right.
And it's a well-known political strategy on both sides to send that false story out there. And Michael's probably been a victim of it at some point in his political career, but send a false story out there, and it doesn't matter if it's true or not, it will stick with people and they'll remember that, or it will, affect their perception of that person more subconsciously, even if they don't remember it.
It's kind of like, it makes me think about, the American Library Association that'll give awards to horrible books that, but then they call it an award-winning book.
Sure.
And things like that. And it just, same thing with the counselors. Some of the school counselors are taught so many bad methods, and just their belief system is all wrong, and they're counseling our children in schools, and that's not good. They're not really counselors, and schools have started focusing more on social and emotional than they are on academics at this point.
Yeah, well, the Democrats are Democrats are really good with this. They employ it with their Alinsky tactics. They know what they're doing,
Yeah.
and for a large group of people who may not believe in God, may or may not believe in God, and also who don't believe in reality. This kind of postmodern trend is we create our own reality. So if we lie to you enough, then that becomes your reality, and you'll do what we want you to.
So I have a question for you. Having been a public school teacher and studied education for numerous years. So really the Teachers College at Columbia University was where all of the real push to push Marxism into public school classrooms began to start happening. And the teachers that were being trained at Columbia were the ones that went out into the classrooms and did, just exactly, what they were supposed to do. So we kind of have a ground zero, if you will, from where all of the I'm going to call it non-American type training came from in our public schools. Is there a place where this kind of started with psychologists? Because, I remember do you remember what was it, M. Scott Peck, The Road Less Traveled? I don't know if you remember reading that or not. I read that when I was 13 years old. He was a psychologist, and it was a really good book about, if you you do have reality, and you do have, every action has a reaction, and you have to be in charge of yourself in order to make sure that you're doing what you need to be doing to be successful. And it was a really great book. So I know that psychologists at some point were, like teachers primarily, interested in just truth and doing, what was right. I just don't feel like that is the way it is kind of anymore in almost any profession. So is there kind of a ground zero in psychology where you kind of feel like maybe it started going awry a little bit?
I haven't come up with one that I think is a legitimate one. I think it parallels culture so much, and and psychology professors have always been more liberal leaning, right? But you may have had some moderates, you may have had some moderate conservatives, but they tended to be more liberal leaning all along. Like, so for me, as best I can look back, are more senior professors that I would encounter early in my career, right? So that started 25 years ago, as I was encountering graduate professors that were more senior, and then at that point, the ones that were 60 years old 25 years ago are now 85 years old, and so they went to school in the 50s and 60s, and there was apparently a little bit of a shift there. And I blame the baby boomers for a lot of stuff, right? The baby boomer tantrums have created a lot of the problems we have. And no one seems to want to say that because the baby boomers are still, somewhat in power. And it's not trendy to say that. But, think about what the 1960s were like culturally. And there was a lot of stuff on campus. And, my dad was a professor in the 70s, early 70s on. And I asked him once, what was the biggest change? Since I'm a professor, I said, as a professor for you, what was the biggest change that you saw across the course of time? And I thought he was going to say students became more lazy or whatever. And he said, the drug use. He said the drug use was incredible in the early 70s when he started teaching. And he said, students would smoke pot on campus. They'd smoke pot outside the classroom in the hallway where people could smoke, cigarettes, right? They're everywhere. And he's like, and people came to class high all the time. And he said, actually things have gotten way better than they were in the 60s. And then even now though, and I asked him that question about 10 years ago, even now it's hard to get people to remember just how crazy the 60s were. And, it's easy for us to feel like everything's gone off the rails right now, but the 60s were pretty bad. And so those professors that were trained in the 60s were on campus at that time. And I think that was probably pretty influential on them. You had Timothy Leary, you had people taking, drugs to try to figure out, and for psychology experiments, what was going on.
Yeah.
So I think that just coming out of that, it was hard to stay on track.
Well, and even eating poison mushrooms. I mean, I am a child of the, I graduated high school in 75. So I remember just the culture at that time, plus the Vietnam War, that ended late 60s, and all of those things. There was a lot of suicide. There was a lot of, drug use was just rampant. And yeah, I agree with that. And yes, I do agree that my generation has done a lot of damage. a lot
Well,
of damage. Yeah.
how do you relate that, Doc, to your past tenure as a professor here at UCO, and kind of what you saw there? Maybe how political was it at UCO, and why did you leave, and kind of just the whole atmosphere, while you're there? What do you observe kind of with that?
Well, okay, so I taught for 20 years too, so I guess I've got a track record to look at. When I started teaching at UCO, in the early 2000s, there were more. Most of the students were. I was probably 60% male. And people would ask me later on in my career, like, what do you miss? And I said, I miss males. There are no males in my classes anymore. Like, they've just gone away from the field. They've gone away from the university, and it's a female dominated, which that's fine. Those students are great, but I do miss having males in the classroom. So that was one big change. But when I started, your classrooms were largely, conservative students that you had to be careful about all the things you might be careful of portraying as far as research studies that would offend the conservatives or the Christians, which wasn't, my perspective coming as a Christian. And when I talk about certain things, was made it more palatable to them. But then it totally flipped, right? So by the end of my career, you've got, all woke students in the classroom, and that are the vocal ones, and then you've got a very small minority of conservative students, and Christian students are a very small minority of that. And so there was a pretty large shift even in that 20-year span. I didn't leave over the politics. When I started teaching, it was known that faculty were very liberal, but they mostly kept it out of the classroom from whatever I could tell, and it was just kind of a mild annoyance, right? If politics came up, then there might be a few comments or things, but most people didn't really talk about it much. And it was definitely not an issue in the classroom or beyond that, other than if you went to maybe, liberal arts in the sociology department or someplace like that. But then that changed over time. And there was 2016 when Trump won, just seemed to just completely mess up everybody. And people didn't recover from that. It was a sad state on campus when people are so upset over something like that, right? I didn't cry when Barack Obama won. I was like, all right, well, I hope he does a good job because he's still our president. And that was not the reaction. You had high-level administrators taking leave to fly across the country to go put their special little hats on and go march in DC for those kind of things. And it was just insanity.
The pink hats.
Yeah, those hats. I didn't want to say what they were, but yeah, those hats.
I'm not going to say it. I'm just saying they were pink. That's all I'm saying. Hat. So I got to ask you a question.
But I didn't. Sorry, I should have finished that.
Oh, okay.
I didn't leave because of any of that stuff. I left because I just wanted a different challenge, and so I wanted to start my own company and do consulting and apply the psychology that I know how to do. So I didn't leave because I was unwelcome. They were extremely welcoming. I was have a lot of friends there. It was a good experience for me. But I've heard that things have changed since I've left. So.
Well, I have a question for you because I've been reading The Naked Communist, which I read a long time ago, but I don't think I was in the same frame of mind when I read it originally that I am. And I'm picking up so much stuff. And it's very clear from that book how the Marxists, what their plans are and how they intended to flip the culture here in America. And they had specific plans. And one of them was to get people to question the truth. What is truth? There isn't a universal truth anymore, because universal truth, at least the way I understand it, was based on, on a higher power, essentially. And if there's no higher power, then there's no truth, and there's, nothing there. And I just, as a kind of as a gag the other day, I made a post that basically just said, facts aren't hateful. That's all I said. It was just 3 words. Facts aren't hateful. And I got an interesting response. This came on our Facebook page from a man who said, and this is what he said after I said 3 words. The facts you're referring to are twisted by hateful people to make facts that work for them. It's not the same thing. It's a fact that you are hateful to begin with because they don't look and act how you approve. Also, if you get your facts from a cult and or a 2,000-year-old book, then they are only facts to your cult and not real life, where people are not held to your junk belief system just because you demand it. And it went on, because I like to engage these people, because at some point in time, because I know he's not going to, really, honestly, it's going to take an act of Jesus to fix that guy. But I like to argue with these people because I want other people who are reading to see the illogic in their commentary. Where does this illogic come from psychologically? What are we doing that are producing people that find 3 words hateful and then go on to attack you as a Christian when it was just 3 words and they don't even know who you are? And is there a way to come back from that?
It's definitely a very thin-skinned culture that we live in, right?
Yes, it is.
How do you come back from that? Psychologically, that has to be a psychology. Is it not, where you just see everything as hate?
Yeah, that becomes your worldview. Your worldview is a, I guess that would probably fall on the category of depressive pessimism. And so there's a scale I used to work with called the future event expectancy scale, and it was like, you're basically rating things like, what are the probability that I will end up in jail sometime in my life, right? And there's a probability, Jenny, that you'll end up in jail. You got to figure out what you think.
Well, I almost had one, so yeah.
Yeah, so there's a probability that you could there's still time. But there's a probability, right? So on that question, like, it's not 0, right? For anybody, it's not 0. And so maybe somebody puts it pretty low or they put it pretty high. And then across all those questions, you've got somebody's level of what's called depressive pessimism. And so I would assume that this guy scores pretty high on the expectancies that negative things are going to happen to people, and it's out of their control.
So hate seems to be a topic that we can't get away from on the left. And again, to me, hate is a psychology. To me, because
well, think about what the left does, right? They yell at us very hatefully that we're supposed to love.
Exactly.
Right. Well, that's what they do.
That form groups that call moms that are interested in their children's education
terrorists. Yeah.
Terrorists. Yeah. Domestic terrorists.
Yeah. So they're fueled by hate. So Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations shows that, there's 5 different moral foundations, and conservatives use all of them to evaluate information, and liberals tend to use 2. And one of them is social justice and fairness, essentially. And so when that's everything is fair, so we have the ability to get angry about social injustices. Conservatives get angry about, true actual racism and things like that. But liberals, they funnel everything through those moral foundations. So they're always outraged about something. And it's easy to manipulate if you can just make everything seem like an injustice, and then they're all going to get all fired up.
So I was not always a conservative. My husband loves to remind me about when I was in college. And I wasn't. Is it a personal thing? Is it an outside thing that becomes a personal thing? How does a person change their psychology? I mean, change the way they look at things. How does that actually happen to people?
Well, experience, right? I mean, having kids, having families can changes people. I mean, we do change somewhat over time. There's parts of our personality that don't change, but that's a more of a worldview thing that you've got. Like if you were, a liberal earlier in your life, you were probably still fired up and passionate about the things you thought about, and then now you're fired up and passionate about the conservative things that you're thinking about. There's been research that shows, and this is a little bit older research, so it doesn't get discussed much, but it was shows that people's attitudes become more conservative over time as they age. So that's completely normal. But of course, liberals don't cover that kind of research anymore because they don't want people to know that, hey, you might become more conservative as you get older. But that was always a pretty common thing that was taught and discussed in attitudes and persuasion classes.
So again, how do you, I think, Julia and Michael and I think part of the reason why we're all involved is we would like to see things change. We want to give, people information so that they can make a change. How do you, outside of just out and out propaganda, which, the left uses, and when I was in advertising, we used it obviously, but, that's not something that I think is the best way to go about it. How do you kind of help people see things differently?
Yeah, well, one of the problems is that we have these echo chambers, right?
Yes.
It's even if you wanted to put out a bunch of propaganda, you can't get it in front of the audience that needs to see it.
Right.
All you can do is get it in front of the audience that already agrees with you. Some of that is the internet. The internet's done wonderful things. It's allowed us to have this show. It's allowed you to get this information out. It's allowed for a lot of wonderful things and get a lot of voices out. But you have all of the targeted advertising stuff, right? So you're only going to see things that relate to things you're already interested in. So whether you do a Google search or the Google ads that pop up or any suggestions that are for you are, hey, you already think this way. What do you think about this? And so you're not going to be, it's very difficult to expose yourself to other things. The Democrats do not seem interested in progressives in general, don't seem interested in, critical thinking or analyzing information. So they grab the propaganda and they push it forward. Conservatives have always had a kind of a more broad coalition of different people. There's, my audience, I have to remember, are not all Christian conservatives. Some of them are atheist libertarians that align with me on a lot of things and find what I have to say interesting. And so there's, we have a broader kind of coalition of Republicans, which means we've got different audiences that we have to cater to. And that becomes more challenging. So we can't just push everybody out on a unified message of, anger at this one particular injustice. And so that's one of our challenges.
Jenny, I wanted to go back to that comment that the guy told you about how your facts are not truth or whatever it is. And that's
wait, I only said 3 words.
Yeah. Well, that's something I wanted to talk to Dr. Mather about is solipsism, because that is something that I think is the base of everything that's going on. A lot of people don't know that or have never even heard of that word, but that's basically where your perception is your truth. Your perception are facts. Your perception is who you are. It's kind of like epigenetics, dictating everything about you rather than the actual gene code itself. And to me, that's the base of all of this. That's from all these crazy views to multiple genders to the transgender stuff. And it's just affecting education, I think, at the base level, because people are just disregarding, the actual facts, common law, truth, justice, all the basic tenets of our society, and just going around and putting it into, well, I don't believe this is that. I believe it's this. So that's, that, and it's all just like smoke and mirrors. And I think it goes back into Marxism and all those things. It's designed basically to disrupt, the actual authority of natural law that God has given us. But I'd like Dr. Mather just to talk about that, the impact of solipsism, through his lens of psychology.
Well, I mean, it's going to be very powerful, right? You made an extremely once as soon as you take away accountability, right? So, and I wasn't familiar with the term solipsism, but then when I looked it up after you texted me that, it said, "Hey, I'm going to ask you about this." I'm like, "Okay, well, what the hell is that?" So I looked it up and I'm like, okay, so that's a word from Michael's reality. It's not really in my world. I don't ever study this stuff at all. But no, as soon as you take away the accountability to other people, right? So if the world is what I've created in my mind and it's all about me and it's all about what I think and what I do. And, I guess apparently at the fundamental nature of that solipsism stuff, I think the entire world is just in my head. I'm just laying there somewhere dreaming this. And then if you move out a little bit beyond that, it's just more of a very selfish kind of perspective. And that fits with what we've seen in psychology with the push towards increasing self-esteem. So there was, the Rosenberg scale came out in 74, I think. And the Rosenberg scale came out and assessed self-esteem. It hasn't changed a lot over time. It's given us really good measures of how self-esteem has changed. There was a big push in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s to increase self-esteem. And then Roy Baumeister came out with an article back in, I think, 2003 around there. And it was a long study of all of this showing that, okay, increasing self-esteem is helpful to a certain degree, but if you keep increasing self-esteem in kids in the classroom, you have all kinds of other problems. And so, and then that was very controversial. People didn't want to hear it because people don't want to hear that the thing that they've been saying all along is possibly incorrect. And so, that's what the whole world has been focused on for the past 45 years, really since I was born, is everybody gets a trophy. If it doesn't go your way, then it's not like, hey, maybe you need to make a change or push harder at something. That those values that a lot of us have and try to push forward are not what they get in a lot of other places. And it's really all about, it's all about you. And it's a kind of a hedonistic mentality. If you don't have God or you don't have other people that you're accountable to, it's just all about you. And then that's how you end up where we're at.
My mom, who's an educator, said, back in the Dr. Spock, she had gone to some Dr. Spock convention or conference or something, and she heard him speak, and she said all this time he's talking about self-esteem, building up your children, and she said I so badly wanted to raise my hand and say, my children think very highly of themselves. How do you bring them down a notch? There's a balance there.
I know, and there's something to be said, and maybe this, I haven't really put any thought into this, but a two-parent home, right? So my mom, I remember seeing a Dr. Spock book that was covered in dust sitting on the bookshelf, and she built me up, my whole life. Like, you can do this stuff, you have to work hard at it, right? The right kind of values. But she's always very unconditionally supportive, which in my mind is how a mother should be. My dad was a good balance to that, right? Like, he brought me back to reality pretty regularly. And so the two parents, I think are also important to all of this equation.
Yeah.
And that's an excellent point. But
my dad was supportive.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my dad was supportive of me too. I don't mean to say he's not, but he was a more traditional dad. He's not quite a baby boomer. He was born before that, and so he was a little bit more traditional, kind of old school in things, and it worked well to have that balance. But a lot of nowadays the family's not even an emphasis, right? I mean, a lot of the right. BLM or some other groups, the progressives in general, try to discredit or take down the family unit intentionally, right? They've said that. And there's a difference between trying to, make a kid who doesn't have a father present not feel bad when you're having a Father's Day weekend for a group, versus trying to make everything funnel into that situation, which is the same thing we see in schools where they try to teach to the lowest common denominator instead of, right. Whenever I taught, I always said, I feel like I have two different classrooms. I'm having to pull one group along and I'm trying to push one group forward.
Right. So I want to go back a little bit to what you were talking about. Would we not call the self-esteem push, isn't that narcissism, really? I mean,
it became that. It becomes that eventually, I think.
Yeah, exactly what Julia said. Trying to build somebody's self-esteem is a good thing if they're lacking self-esteem, if they need that push, if they're in a weak moment or whatever. But then, unconditional, let's bring self-esteem to the max, that becomes a problem. That's narcissism. Yeah.
Well,
Well,
in your opinion, Doc, I mean, let's take the internet out of this. Let's just go back to kids in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. Is this coming through like the removal of academics more or less in education, or is this and kind of replacing it with these social concepts and all these things? I mean, is it go back to how these kids are in public school and just how public school has changed? I mean, do you contribute a large piece to that, or is it something just cultural and just social in how we live now?
Well, the public schools are important, right? Because that's the common experience that most people in the United States have. And that's why, the Democrats and progressives see that as such an important institution to capture. You capture them when they're young, you shape them the way you want to shape them. And so, yeah, I mean, the less academic information that's going into, like legitimate things, like, hey, the less math you're working on and the more you're putting in cultural references to try to do things into your math class, the less they're learning math stuff, right? I just need,
Right.
when I taught college, I'm like, I wish that they would have just learned like chemistry and chemistry class and math class and biology class, and that they were prepared when they got to me, because they don't know a lot of these basic things that I'll say things to them like, hey, I remember this, you learned this in 7th grade science. But the reality is they don't. They didn't get a lot of that stuff when they were supposed to, because there's just not enough time, and there's all this other junk that goes into it. There's a fine line, look at how, going back to the early 80s and maybe the mid 80s, multicultural push in workplaces and public schools, places like that was different than what we see now. Like, that was kind of a, hey, everybody's not the same, so let's try to remember that there are some differences. And then now all of a sudden it's completely bastardized and changed as we get into the critical race stuff. But the multicultural stuff of 30 years ago, which I think accidentally laid the groundwork for the critical race theory stuff. That stuff was important, right? I'm Hispanic, and I grew up in a community that there were very few Hispanics, and people didn't understand all the things that went on in my life. And I wouldn't have wanted to sit there and talk about it in class, but for the teacher to at least say, hey, this guy is a little bit different, and hey, this other student is a little bit different for the other stuff, and to recognize that as a teacher, that would have been a good thing. But we're not at that point now. We're at the point of putting people in piles, sorting them out, and making things worse. I had so when I taught social psychology, I taught stereotypes and discrimination, and I did it in a very, what would probably be considered, down the middle of the road kind of way. And then there were other professors that were, white professors that would do this, and they would, do it a very different way. And we had a discussion one time at a thesis defense with a Hispanic student, and they said, somebody else asked me, like, how do you guys navigate this? You both teach the same class. How do you do it? And I said, well, we don't really address like anybody's color in the room. Like, we never talk about that. We talk about the science specifically of what we're talking about, the psychological mechanisms, but I never single people out and say, hey, you're a brown person, et cetera, or whatever. And the other professor, who's white, said, well, I always have people like raise their hands and talk about their ethnicity and do that. And then some of the students laughed, and they said, what? And I said, well, we hate that. We all the brown students look at each other and they say, oh no, they're getting ready to call for the brown students again. Right. So, and it was the exact opposite ways of handling those situations. And so that's where I think that this public schools are at now, is it mirrors the private or the higher education, where everybody is trying to have good intentions, thinking, okay, let's sort them out this way, and this will be good for them. And brown people are saying, no, we don't want to do that. I say brown people, I can say that, right? Because I'm Hispanic. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's where we're at now, is that it went from multicultural, which was just kind of like a little bit of awareness of differences, to, critical race theory, which is let's create group differences and invoke chaos based on that.
One of the things that I've always, it was just one of the simple things, but when you're applying for a job or something like that, it seems to me that if that race was not anywhere on the application, that's the way to get rid of the racial preferences on a job applian.
Yeah, I've always looked at it as yeah, you're right, and I've always looked at it as, when talking about diversity, if you've got two candidates that are completely equal on everything, and then one of them maybe speaks a language of a lot of the customers that you're going to have, that would be kind of an extra asset, then that's an extra asset, right? But
Right.
sorting them out, saying I need to recruit this many of this or whatever,
Right.
is problematic. And I see this on a lot of government contracts, for my business that I have to look over for different things, where you've got to say all these different categories that you will not discriminate on, and they're wanting you to show that you have these things. I'm like, well, I don't have any idea what the political affiliation is of anybody that I hire, or, I don't know the ethnicity. I don't ask those things. I don't hire based on those things. I hire based on, can you do this job? And if I end up with a diverse group, that's just because it just happened that way. How many women do you have, or men do you have? Yeah, I'm not looking for a certain number of women. I'm not thinking I need to hire a person of this particular social category, of this political persuasion. Like, I don't discriminate on any of those things. I just try to hire people that can do the job, and I think I'll work well with.
Well, and it seems to me that that's the worst for self-esteem, because let's say that you have somebody who's hired because of a quota, and then you get into the job and you weren't skilled enough to do the job in the first place, but you were hired because you were part of a quota. Well, now you can't do the job, and now you feel bad about yourself, or now you're angry, or now it just doesn't seem to me like that even is satisfying to anybody's, person.
And that's what
seems like it's not helpful all the way around.
Yeah, and there was a decade of research in the 80s, so a lot of this came up, after 1964, and then the 70s and through the 80s, and there were a lot of revisions to the laws over that on how you can do quotas or not do quotas. But there was a decade of research in the 80s that showed that companies were better, had problems when they hired people based on quotas. And it wasn't just that they hired unqualified people, because as those laws got sorted out, what it showed was that people assumed that anybody of any particular social category, whether it was a woman or a person of an ethnic category or whatever, that they were only there because of that category. And so they were deemed as being less, less competent.
Right.
Was one of the measures by all of their peers. When even the good ones, like no matter what, it didn't matter. Like, everybody was kind of screwed over by this, because there was the possibility, or a lot of times people got hired for quotas. So that meant that even, good workers of a social category who got hired for their merits, who were doing good jobs, were viewed as being less competent and assumed to have been hired on a quota. And so that was bad for everybody.
It was. I remember those days. I worked in a court office with 22 women. It was very interesting.
And let's put all the women together, right?
But all the women in one big office. That's healthy.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, can you explain a little what you do because you were just saying that in your business, you look at a lot of, can you explain a little bit what you do?
Sure. So my business is Mather Professional Services, and I apply behavioral science to companies. And so it might be helping them figure out consumer behavior or employee behavior. It might be helping them with organizational changes. If they've got a cultural change in the organization they want to change. It's a lot of statistics and research design for private firms. And so if they've got a behavioral study that they want to create, or they think can answer a question for them, then they may hire me to help them design the study and run it and do all the statistics and give them a report, that kind of thing. We've got a business presence here in Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Wichita, Kansas, and then also in Lubbock, Texas. But we work all over the country.
That's one of the things that I hear complaints about a lot from a lot of different people is is work culture, and particularly HR's, human relations offices inside businesses, and kind of their involvement in culture. Is that kind of one thing that you do, is kind of work on business culture?
Yeah, sometimes I advise on those kind of things, and you see companies that do it well, and you see companies that do it poorly. It's kind of everything that you might think. The ones that do it well, they're not separating people by social category. They're just kind of, creating a really positive culture all the way around, but they're not putting out all the woke stuff that you see in a lot of corporate places. So they end up doing a good job and not having those challenges.
That's good. Actually, that's very good to know. Anybody? I keep asking questions.
Well, I have a
Well,
question.
I want to get into a couple things very specifically, especially the transgender stuff, and also just kind of the overall victim mentality of kind of how our society, especially our kids, seem to always just be almost taught that in school. But I know, like with your podcast, which is refreshing, you're always talking about sports and some other things, and I appreciate that. But I want to get your take on the nuns, on the transgender nuns going out, because I know you're a baseball guy.
Mm-hmm.
Going out to Dodger Stadium and that whole event. Did Fox interview you for that, or was it just the transgender study itself from the 90s? But I do want to just get your take on that transgender in sports.
Yeah, they just interviewed me for the transgender study that came out in the 90s. It was what Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence.
Yes,
It's just a made up anti-Catholic group that does a lot of really disgusting sacrilegious things. And for whatever reason, the Los Angeles Dodgers thought it was okay to bring them in, and everybody clap and they introduce them to the crowd and honor them for Pride Month. And there was some resistance, and so they got disinvited, and then there was more resistance from the other side, so they got reinvited. And I guess that a lot of the Catholics in the area, which make up an extremely high percentage of people in Southern California and the Los Angeles area, which would be the people attending the Los Angeles Dodgers games, they protested and they blocked the streets. And so when they were introduced before the game, there were hardly anybody in the stands. Like, I would say probably 75 to 100 people in this giant stadium. Nobody cheering for the people that came out and got introduced. But I don't understand why a company would put themselves in that position and then double down and keep doing it. That's just crazy. And it's just, the group is disgusting, and it should have no attention at all by anybody ever. They're just a terrible group.
Well, they're intentionally trying to hate a group. I mean, they are
right. They're not. Yeah, they're not an alternative religion, right? They're just a group that's mocking religion. Like, would we be okay with that if it was any non-Christian, religious group that was being mocked in some way? I mean, I don't think so.
Right.
Well, and not just religious, Christians particularly.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, I mean,
that's what I mean. If it was, they do.
Yeah.
But if it was any other religion that was being mocked, the Dodgers probably wouldn't have brought them in.
Or because that was group at all.
Yeah, because they do an upside down, where they put a guy upside down on the cross, and I mean, it's really honestly just beyond. It's beyond. But Michael, you had a second.
Well, yeah. Well, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts in general as to just this massive explosion of transgender here in the last, really probably 10 years max, maybe not even that long, because it was just such a non-issue when I was growing up, all the way through even raising my kids, my oldest kids. It was never an issue, never really talked about, never really forefront. We didn't have to celebrate it. We didn't have to recognize them. We didn't have to bow down to, this cultural deal. I don't, is this just strictly, is this a mental issue? Is this chemical? Is this happening? I mean, are these people, are they on the spectrum, or are they mental? I mean, what's kind of the demographics that you see around all that?
Well, let me tell you what it was like when I taught this back in, the early 2000s in the biological psychology class or the neuroscience class that I taught. And then I'll tell you what it's like now. So when I would teach about this back in the, 20 something years ago, it's an extremely low percentage of people, incredibly low percentage of people. And for anybody to get a sex change, which is what we called them back then, I know there's a million different terms. I try to not fall into the traps of, the progressive wokes that try to change language and change your concepts. So I stick to the biological terms that we used, years ago, back when science was science. And so sex change. And so it was an incredibly small percentage of people that would ever get those. You couldn't get them in the United States. They would have to go to some faraway country to do it. They could only do it. Even nobody there would do it unless they had, years and years of very specific targeted therapy with, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or whatever. And only then could they like finally sign off on it. And it was like they couldn't do it until they were after 30 years old. And so it was extremely rare for people to ever get to the point where they had these sex changes. And then that was the biology of it. So the study that I was interviewed on, I didn't do the study, but the study was done back in 1991, and Fox News asked me to comment on what I thought would happen today if they did the same study. And the study found that essentially the kind of psychological pathologies of the mother were related to males wanting to become females as children. And so the more kind of neurotic the mom was in a lot of different ways, the more likely the child was to be questioning their gender. And in almost all the cases, there was no father present. The mom was extremely dependent on the child and things like that. All the things that, just kind of on your own, you might have thought, hey, I wonder if this kind of weird stuff might be the problem. Anyway, so now let's fast forward to today. And I said, today, I don't know. You might find a larger effect for the study, but it might also be completely washed out by the fact that it's almost like getting an earring. Now it's something that everybody just wants to do to be counterculture. And think about psychological trends like back in the 20s and 30s when lobotomies were like getting an earring. Lobotomies are something that everybody did to try to release their depression. And they would take what was called a transorbital leucotome, which is like a big ice pick, and they'd shove it up your nose and they would break your skull behind your eyes here, and they would swing it back and forth, and they would break those connections in the brain. And it would help people with depression, but then they would be brain damaged for the rest of their life. A lot of them ended up having to be institutionalized. A lot of them didn't. And so here's a horrible biological thing that you're doing because it's trendy. And that's, I think, where we're at today.
Yeah.
Well, and I was going to say, I just read something. I try to stay very far away from anything that has to do with a celebrity. But I was reading something, an article, and it popped up, and I thought, well, now what is that about? So actress Megan Fox, who has been on, I think, Transformers, was the only thing I can remember right off the top of my head that she was in, has 3 boys, and she literally dresses them up as girls, keeps their hair long, and had literally did an interview with a news, whatever that means anymore, station that said, where she said that when she was pregnant, she could feel that this boy had female tendencies, and she was going to respect that when he was born. I mean, I really hesitate. I mean, I don't like name calling. I just don't like anything like that. But that does not seem, I mean, that seems somehow abnormal thought process to me. I mean, am I wrong?
Yeah, that's not good parenting, right?
But I don't know what
but
I think.
It's not trendy to say that, though, right? Like, you can't say that anymore.
Oh no.
But we can all agree that's pretty bad parenting.
Right. Well, and so as a society, though, I mean, as a Christian, of course, leading people to Christ is the answer. As a society, it's like we're in a gigantic ship. How do you turn the ship back around to, not that the world's ever been, perfect, but to a more, where truth is acceptable to a few more people,
Yeah.
It doesn't seem that it is.
Yeah, well, and that's a good way to put it too. And it's different. As Christians, we're guided by a little different compass on that ship, and we try to turn it in different directions, but also realizing that not everybody is. But then there's some general things that are problematic. Going back to that, I don't know how to do that really. But going back to the sex change stuff. When I was an undergraduate in my senior seminar, I had a feminist professor, and she was teaching us about it was a famous study of a woman, and the idea that feminists had was that they would use this as an example that nurture triumphs over nature. And so the idea was this kid his penis had been ablated during the circumcision, and the parents decided with the doctor to give the kid a sex change, raise him as a girl. And so they're like, see, and he became a girl. And that was always the story that was told. And I, for whatever reason, I don't know if I was driving through rural Missouri and I heard it on talk radio, or I don't know where I knew this from, but I pushed back on the professor, which I did a lot in that class. And I said, yeah, but that's not the whole story. She's like, what are you talking about? I said, well, but then the kid, like, he was very unhappy. Even though he was being raised as a girl and had been changed to a girl, was very unhappy as a teenager, tried to commit suicide several times. And then they finally told, and he said, I want to be a boy. He always tried to pee standing up. He said, I want to be a boy. I feel like I'm supposed to be a boy. And they said, okay, well, here's the deal. Like, you actually are a boy and we turned you into a girl. So he had a sex change back and ended up marrying a woman and adopting children and being a normal male. And that part of the story is never, ever told anywhere. And I read it again recently in Michael Knowles' book. And I was so refreshing to see that I hadn't dreamt that up. That really is the story. But that never gets told, right? That part of the story never gets told. And that's a huge cautionary tale to everybody who's out there doing the stupid thing of changing their kid's sex.
Right.
Well, and I want to mention something to follow up on what you were just saying about the fact that stories aren't getting told. So just very recently, this week, police were called to an apartment in New York City because there was a person they thought was having a heart attack. And so when the policemen and the ambulance workers and that kind of thing went into the apartment, they found a lot of men, between 9 and 11 men. There were a lot of sex toys around. It was very dirty. They were clearly having some kind of a sex party. And in the back room, locked in the back room, were 5 children. And it seems like, from some reporting, maybe even 2 adults in with the children. And I think the thing that, and the reason why I bring this up is because nobody's telling that side of the story. And I think, to me, and probably all of us who are here, and all of us, frankly, who, like to think we think rationally, this is harming children and adults since time immemorial. Their job has been to protect children. I mean, that's what we do as adults. And it seems as though we've become a completely infantilized society where adults don't even know what their jobs are anymore. And certainly, protecting children is, you've got Megan Fox. How is that protecting any of those 3 boys? Well, how is not reporting on the fact that there were children in that apartment clearly being used as sex toys not making the news helping children?
Well, and I think it's buried in what you said there. You said that, our job as adults has always been to protect children. And yes, for the good ones, for the good adults, right? But we're protecting children from who? A lot of times it's other adults. And so those other adults are multiplying in their way of thinking. And they've got an agenda too. And they're taking over a lot of stuff, the adults that we have to protect our kids from. Whether it's stuff that even commercials you hear on the radio or whatever. I mean, there have been several rules of parenting, right? One is you want to always kind of control what your kids are exposed to. But apparently another rule that we didn't realize needed to be a rule is, maybe don't let anybody cut your kids' junk off, right?
Yeah.
And so they've pushed the limits and the boundaries of all of these things, and they're doing it intentionally. I mean, Hollywood has exploited children in so many different ways for many years. And then that's just becoming the norm.
But do you think on that aspect there, Doc, that, to me, the responsibility, I think, kind of lies with academia, because they're always brought in as the expert. To justify, there's some doctor or some psychologist or somebody like that somewhere that's brought in on TV program that says, yes, these people do have, there are these instances. Well, sure. Yeah, I'm sure that there's some people with XXY chromosomes, but for the most part, I mean, you're either male or female genetically. And to me, I always blame, more than any other area, that academia, you could have experts on every single day that says, no, that, this is dysphoria caused by, chemicals or this or that, or, all kinds of other things, but they don't say that. They don't take responsibility. And they just keep seeming to just push that envelope that, yes, there is a million different genders. you can change midday and whatever you want.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the problems. I mean,
It leads to
it's
chaos.
yeah, and it's going to be pushed in schools. I mean, about the only thing we can do is try to huddle around our kids, protect them, and then protect the kids around us. Kind of work your way out. That the schools, public schools, are important. Higher education is important. Those are pretty important things to capture, and the other side is capture them. If we can get those back, that may be the best opportunity to turn the ship around.
Yeah, education is important, but only if it's education. And, what we've got now, so much of it is the farthest thing from education. Our kids are failing in reading, they're failing in math, but they just hired, how many new counselors for this school, and they're lying to our kids, which is opposite of education. The opposite.
Yeah,
We're
it's sad, and it's one of the reasons why I really appreciate what you all are doing.
well, I was going to say something. I'm going to let that go. So we're at an hour and 5 minutes, and I wanted to ask a question. Gosh, I hope you can answer this for us, because I know there are parents that watch us and they're interested on getting information. We, the American School Counselors Association, I talked to you about this before we went on live for today. We've done some research on them, and they are the wokest of the woke. And prior to Ryan Walters, there was a lot of money, taxpayer dollars, that were given to the ASCA to bring counselors into public schools. And I can't speak for every person who is a member of the ASCA, because I wouldn't want to. But as an overall view, if you go to their website, it's very woke. If you have a child, and I've actually talked to, I have a parent, she's in Kansas City, but I do know a woman whose child was pulled aside by a counselor and then pulled into counseling in her school without her knowledge, the parents' knowledge. And basically that counseling session very much upset the child, because she felt like that she was being told things that were not okay with their parent. Is there any advice you can give to parents about their children and counseling in public schools? I mean, do you feel like parents need to be involved anytime there's a counselor involved? Do you feel, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'm just asking you, your thoughts on the topic.
Well, I feel like parents should always be involved, right? I mean, parents should always be notified, of anything that's going on with their kid in the school. I know that I'm not sure how the school counselor organization fits in with like licensed school psychologists. I taught at UCO, and we have there was a school psychology program, and so I know the students that came through there. And as far as from what I could tell, they're very solid. I would trust any of them with my children, as far as that. Their politics don't seem to play a role in anything that they do. I don't even know the politics of most of them. I know a lot of school psychologists, and so I don't know how that fits, like if they would be members of that organization or not or whatever. But I do know that licensed board certified school psychologists, it's a strong credential. They've had very strong training. They wouldn't be the kind of people to push woke stuff on anybody. They would just be very scientifically taking care of problems that they're taking care of. And so, as a parent, I would trust any of them with my children, unless I saw evidence otherwise. And I also think that, I want to be notified. There's no reason why anybody should ever be dealing with your kid and not telling you.
Okay, so that's the basic thing. So if a psychologist at school wants to talk to your child, you should be able to be in that room and should be notified
You should
of
have
that interaction.
You should know about it, and you should have the option to be in the room if you want to. But if you think that the conversation as a parent, if you think that it's going to go better without you being there and you trust the people, then that would be your call as a parent. Yes.
So how do you feel about psychologists in schools? Because I'll be frank, our argument has always been, that's not a place for psychologists is in a public school, because I think the problem is that public school has in history basically shoved parents out and kind of taken over the job of raising those kids. I mean, the kids are with them for 7 hours a day, right? I mean, and parents a lot of times have allowed the school to kind of take over that role for them. And some of the things that, I mean, we've seen a lot of different things in public schools with school psychologists. Do you feel like maybe we're over the top there with that? Do you feel like there is a role for psychologists in schools, so long as parents are involved? I mean, what's your thought there?
Both, really. I mean, so I would have, as an administrator. So I was a dean at UCO. I was an associate dean of the graduate college at UCO. So I was in a lot of decisions that were fairly important, and I would raise those things too, kind of philosophically. I would say, so why do we have this clinic? And it's good for the students. We've got good people running it. I hear from the students that there's very good things that are happening, in the mental health facilities there in a variety of different ways. But is that really something that the universities or colleges need to have? Because those resources exist out in the world, and the argument is always, yeah, but they can't get to those things. So it becomes like a kind of a mission for access of resources, right? So this becomes a liberal world that's going to be full service for everybody and push everybody into that. So that's one of those problems. So I would look at it going, I know the people that are doing this, they're doing a good job. I know the students that are going into those services, and I talk to them, like, good things are happening in these places, but philosophically, do we really need to even have that? It's the same with public schools. I know that genie is kind of out of the bottle as far as school psychologists go. I know that school psychologists that I've talked to, a number of them since COVID, are absolutely necessary right now because of the psychological stunting, I guess you could say, of the students due to the COVID lockdowns for the 2 years that public schools were essentially locked down, and students came back with tremendous behavioral problems. They can't study, they can't do anything. They have a lot of problems, and the caseload has gone through the roof for the school psychologists that have to try to pick up the pieces of those terrible, awful, abusive policies that we had.
Well, they created a crisis, and now they're going to fix it. So
yeah.
well,
but the school psychologists didn't create the crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So the institution created it, and now the institution gets to fix it.
Yes.
And needs more resources to implement their problem and their solution.
So when a parent comes to the school and has a request for their child, and the school, sometimes there's issues. Michael probably has a list of them. There's issues, and the school will actually tell the parent they're wrong, and it's kind of like the thought behind, or just the attitude is, schools know best, parents stay out of the way until we need you. And that has got to be damaging, not just to the immediate situation, but to what a child thinks about his parents. If the school is the one that says, yes, you can, or no, you can't. So how do you get that stopped? Because that's a problem.
Yeah, you just keep pushing like you all are doing. I mean, I know, our local school system here in Edmond has a lot of problems with following exactly kind of that playbook that you're talking about. And having had kids in Edmond public schools, I've got to experience that from a lot of different angles, which is really disappointing too, because there are some really good teachers that my kids had at Edmond public schools, but dealing with administration was always a nightmare. And I usually had to, pull rank of, okay, so I'm an associate dean of a large school. I've been an educator for 20 years. I've taught new faculty and old faculty. I've mentored all of these people. I kind of understand what's going on in your school as an administrator. I've got more experience than you do. I've been over all of the teacher education programs that you all came out of. So maybe listen to what I have to say. No, we know better. And so it's like, okay,
Well, and I mean, there's a whole lot of very well educated parents that are being told, being shut out of the conversation, and
no parent should be shut out of the conversation.
exactly. And anyway, the FOIA requests and all of those things. Why wouldn't that information just be out for parents to see? I mean, that makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Yeah, they want to hide as much as they can. I was an expert witness. I was an expert witness on a public schools CRT case a couple years ago, and I got to see. I can't tell you about it. I can't. It was all sealed and under oath and everything else. But I got to see the curriculum and review the curriculum that was being used from a national organization for the in the public schools there, and it was just truly unbelievable how awful the things that they were teaching kids about race and about it was very divisive and damaging, I think, psychologically to anybody who would be a part of that.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Mather, we're at about 1 hour and 15 minutes. We didn't talk very much today, actually.
Well, I enjoyed it.
Well, I enjoyed it too. I think we all enjoyed it. Is there anything that you
words of wisdom?
Yeah. Oh, that's kind of what I was grasping for there. Thanks, Jules. Yeah. Or what words of wisdom can you leave us with today?
Well, I mean, I think that this all changes with parents and kids and families, right? So be a good parent, be a good parent, raise a good kid, and keep fighting.
Well, I liked what you said earlier too about starting where you are and then going out. Mm-hmm. Right. So like when your kids' friends come over, you're going to attempt to kind of, bring them in a little bit. So I think, it is, those relationships are important, and we can't just exist on Facebook.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and conservatives are pretty good about, living in the real world, and having those connections with family and disconnecting from social media and those kind of things. And progressives tend to not do that as much. That becomes their world. That becomes a reality. I know I have to step away from a lot of, online interactions and just, recenter myself and go coach a softball game and play a round of golf and, go do something with the family, watch a movie that's not, screamed with pop-ups or anything like that, and not check my phone.
Yes. And that's what you do. Get away from go work in my garden.
Yeah.
And those are the best words of wisdom I think that we could get, because technology is a double-edged sword. There are a lot of great things about it, but I mean, to me, it's been kind of, in one way, a huge acceleration of the downfall of society. It's just too easy.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Mather, for being with us today. And I do want you to give your podcast one more time and your website one more time so people know how to find you.
Okay. So my website is theconservativesocialpsychologist.com, and it's got, I have a blog there where I had written a lot of articles. It's got links to my YouTube and Rumble channels. It's got links to, all of the studies that I published. Most of them that are not behind paywalls are on there. And then my podcast is My Patriot Brain, which is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and pretty much wherever you get your podcast.
Awesome.
And it's on, say one more time where it is.
The podcast is on is My Patriot Brain. It's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much most other platforms.
I just wanted to make sure that when you're trying to spell and you feel like you're under pressure,
like there's people watching.
I know. I was like, how do you spell podcast again? But I got it up there. So please, everybody, look up Dr. Mather, and thank you again so much for being with us today. And we hope to hear from you again soon. And maybe we'll be like Fox and call you on for specific things.
Sure, anytime.
Thanks a lot. We really appreciate you.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye. That was a wonderful conversation. My goodness, that man, I think we probably do need to have him on a regular basis to kind of try to help us.
Help us maneuver through this crisis.
That's right. Help us make sense of some of the things that are going on in the world around us. So I did look on for Wednesday, next Wednesday, because don't forget, we're on Wednesdays and Fridays from
Right.
9 a.m. to 10-ish.
Right. Well, this is the 28th, right?
Correct.
It's going to be, Michael and I are going to be talking to Dana Mooney, who is the chair of the Canadian County Moms for Liberty. And we're going to talk about how Moms for Liberty these days gets to live rent free in a lot of educators' heads. It's almost comical if they weren't brutal, but that and some of the things that they've had to put up with at school board meetings. Dana's been at city council meetings, school board meetings, all of these things that affect their life and their community. And they don't like people to ask questions. Isn't that something? They're there to serve, but they don't want you to tell them anything or ask any questions. So maybe not so much serve themselves a lot of the time.
I hate to keep going back to this, but I'm okay with that because I know that if people hear things more than one time, they're out to look them up. So reading The Naked Communist, one of the things that I was listening to as I was working in the garden as I listened to it, although I have ordered the book so that I can pull some things out, because I was really struck by the way that Skousen, as he's talking about what these communists do, essentially all I had to do was go, oh, I can tie that to this thing happening. Oh, I can tie that to this thing happening. So there are specific things that are Marxist, absolutely 100% Marxist, and they're doing them right now. And one of the things that they're doing is they were the communists, and of course they took everything from the Marx and Engels playbook, but the communists said when they were brought, Whittaker Chambers kind of brought them out from undercover in the 40s, and we had all of the red tide, remember, and that kind of thing. The communists told their agents, look, the thing that you need to do is you need to start calling these people crazy and telling people, undermine them in the public, make sure people think that there's something wrong with them. You make them look as badly as they possibly can, because then they'll forget, and that's exactly where all of that started. And that's exactly what's happening with Moms for Liberty today. It's a complete Marxist tactic. There is no other way. And the psychology of it is that, like Dr. Mather said, people, you hear things so many times and you tend to believe them. And Marx knew that. And that's why this was part of their playbook. So what is happening is 100% Marxist. I don't really care what you think about me. It is what it is. They have their playbook. If you don't read the playbook, don't comment on it. But it's all there, for people to read. So I'm sorry, I'm going to miss that one because I'll be on the road and I won't get to hear it. I'll have to look it up later.
Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, same thing. It's like, there it is right there.
Well, you know what's funny? What's so funny about that whole thing is when you bring this up, when you bring up Marxism or something from the 40s or 50s that, was pretty tried and true, and our government tried to do they were actually fighting it because of those tenets are so dangerous, to a republic. But when you bring that up in normal conversation with someone, they literally think you're crazy. They're like,
and they'll do this.
There's no socialism. That doesn't exist. That's some construct from the Cold War. I mean, but if they would just be open-minded enough to even read that book from Cleon, I mean, it would absolutely just change the way they think, because they would see, hey, all this stuff in this book is actually happening right now, and this was from 60 years ago.
And it is. I mean, the craziest thing is it is literally happening right now. Every time in every chapter, he'll say something and I'll go, oh my gosh, that's this, that's X, or that's what we just saw yesterday. Or so, it really is. It is something that frustrates me but that's what Marx, that was the Marx and Engels playbook, is, bring them up inside well. And Lenin, Lenin believed that public schools were the place where you brought up everybody in the communist ideal. So, and schools were supposed to be there for kids as soon as they were born.
Yeah. Well,
but Senator Pemberton told us he didn't see a Marxist behind.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, for me, guys like Dr. Mather, they give me hope that, academia is not ruined. Psychology is not ruined. There are people out there that have common sense, have morals and Christian values, and can apply. That's a very specific science that most people have, they know nothing about psychology or how all these things, works. And that's why people like him are so special, I think, in our society, because they can either be really bad or really good. They can really dictate policy on a larger scale in schools, in public education, in businesses, in the corporate world, and they can affect the ethos of an entire company, just like Anheuser-Busch or
Disney.
Antics. Yeah, and Disney. I mean, if they had a guy like Dr. Mather on that side of the spectrum rather than the other side, it would be completely different.
Right.
Well, and the thing is that people often tell us, we're closed-minded or hateful, like our friend, who thought I was hateful for saying 3 words. People often think that we're hateful when we say this, but the crazy thing is, and the most frustrating thing is, we are extremely open-minded. And I mean, we listen to
learn.
If you're not open-minded, how do you learn? If, like Dr. Mather said, I mean, the worst problem that we have is that we're all living in some kind of an echo chamber, in a bubble, and you can't get information in, and you have a hard time, getting information out. And that's when we become siloed like that, it doesn't matter if you're open-minded or not. If you can't get the information out, or you can't get information in, then, it's extremely destructive and detrimental to, what we're trying to do here as a society. And what we're trying to do here as a society is not generate hate, and it's just to follow truth. So I don't know. But I loved having Dr. Mather on, because you're right. I mean, we have to be glad that there are people out there that are open-minded and are thinking about things and being thoughtful,
And I know a ton of educators, and many of them would never try to steer a child away from their parents. And, I don't ever want to put all teachers, etc., or all of anybody in a category. And I do appreciate the fight that they are up against. But even some of the ones that are doing good, they're forced, or they say, well, I had to do that because, they're afraid to lose their job.
Yeah.
Well, and that's true.
Remember when Danita Brown was traveling with us fighting Common Core, it was a fight for her job all the time.
It was. God bless Danita. Well, guys, we're at almost 30 minutes after, so I'm going to go ahead and we'll bring up the music and try to get out of here for now. But like you said, Julia, you and Michael will be here next Wednesday, and they'll be talking to Dana Mooney. So thank you so much, everybody, for being with us today. We always appreciate all of you who tune in, and we'll be here again on Wednesday. So have a really great weekend, and we'll see you next Wednesday.